Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt, cried the pregnant girl. Then the mountain man did this. Snow whips across a lonely mountain cabin as 3 rough men shove a battered woman into the dirt. She's crying, clutching her belly, begging for mercy. Then, out of the blizzard, steps a giant mountain man with a rifle and a haunted look in his eyes. One warning shot splits the night, and the men scatter like wolves. He carries her inside, but what he finds changes everything. A letter written by his dead wife's preacher, sent years after she passed, asking him to protect this broken stranger. Why was this woman sent to him of all people? What secret is she hiding that men are willing to kill for? And when the snow melts and blood stains the valley, will mercy or vengeance rule this mountain? Because sometimes, the most wounded souls are the ones chosen to heal others. Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled through the Colorado mountains like a wild beast, whipping snow into stinging clouds that bit at any exposed skin. Luke Redden paused in his work on the cabin roof, his weathered hands gripping the hammer tight as another gust threatened his balance. Dark clouds roiled overhead, promising worse to come. "Ain't gonna finish this today," he muttered, gathering his tools. The patch would have to hold until the storm passed. Carefully he made his way down the crude ladder, his boots finding each rung with the sure-footedness of a mountain man who'd lived these heights for nigh on 15 years. The day was dying fast, earlier than usual with the storm's darkness. Luke's joints ached as he carried his tools to the lean-to beside his cabin. The familiar scents of pine tar and leather welcomed him as he stored everything in its proper place. Order meant survival up here, where the nearest settlement was 2 days' ride through good weather. Inside his cabin, Luke moved with practiced efficiency. The interior was spare but neat, a wooden table he'd built himself, a bed in one corner, shelves lined with preserved foods and necessities. He'd learned to live with little after Sarah passed. These days, he only kept what served a purpose. The hearth still held warm coals from morning, and Luke soon had a fire crackling. He hung his heavy coat on its peg and was reaching for the coffee pot when he heard it. Voices carrying through the wind, harsh and mean with laughter. Then a sound that made his spine stiffen. A woman's cry full of fear and pain. Luke stood stock still, listening. The sound came again, closer now, accompanied by cruel male laughter. His rifle was already in his hands before he'd finished the thought. The weapon was as familiar as an old friend, its stock smooth from years of use. He eased the cabin door open, letting in a blast of snow and wind that nearly stole his breath. Through, the whiteout. Dark shapes moved like shadows come to life. Luke's eyes, trained by years of tracking, made out 3 men. They were circled around something. No, someone, fallen in the snow. A woman lay curled on the ground, trying to protect herself as boots swung at her. The men wore railroad graders' clothes, their faces red with cold, and something worse. Whiskey fumes carried even through the sharp winter air. "Please," the woman's voice was barely a whisper. "Don't kick me. I'm already hurt." The plea seemed to amuse her tormentors. One drew back his foot for another kick, and Luke had seen enough. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The report cracked through the storm like thunder. The graders scattered like startled rabbits, stumbling and cursing as they disappeared into the whiteout. Luke kept his rifle ready until their footsteps faded, then hurried to the woman's side. She was conscious, but barely. Her clothes were soaked through with snow, her face pale except where bruises were already forming. When he knelt beside her, she reached for him with trembling hands. "Easy now," Luke said, keeping his voice gentle despite the rage still burning in his chest. "You're safe. Let's get you somewhere warm." He gathered her into his arms, careful of any injuries. She was light, too light, but he felt the swell of her belly against his chest. His jaw tightened. A woman with child, and those animals had been kicking her. Inside the cabin, Luke laid her on his bed, quickly wrapping her in the warmest blankets he owned. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep brown irises clouded with pain and fear. "Name's Luke Redden," he said, moving to the hearth where he set a pot of snow to melt. "You're in my cabin, about 20 miles east of Cannon City. Those men are gone now." "Riley," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Riley Quinn." Luke nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he prepared the tea. He'd learned long ago that sudden moves frightened, hurt things, whether they walked on 2 legs or 4. "You're with child," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Her hand moved protectively to her middle. 4 months along. The tea was ready. Luke helped her sit up enough to sip it, noting how she winced at the movement. "You're on foot," he observed. "In this weather. Must be something mighty important driving you out here." Riley's fingers tightened around the tin cup. "Important enough to die for, maybe," she said softly. "But not just my life now." She looked down at her belly, and Luke saw tears gather in her eyes. "Well," Luke said, standing to stoke the fire, "ain't nothing dying here tonight. Storm's got us trapped for a spell anyway. Best you rest and warm up proper." He busied himself around the cabin, giving her space while keeping an eye on her condition. The wind screamed outside, but the cabin's thick logs held firm. Luke had built it to withstand the mountain's worst back when. He'd still had hope of making a real home here with Sarah. Riley's breathing eventually steadied, some color returning to her cheeks. The tea and warmth were doing their work. Luke saw her studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, weighing whether to trust him with whatever secret had driven her into the storm. That was fine. Trust, like anything worth having, took time to build. For now it was enough that she was safe and warm, her child protected from the storm's fury and men's cruelty. As darkness claimed the mountain completely, Luke settled into his chair by the fire. His rifle stayed close at hand. Those graders might think twice about returning, but a wise man didn't count on a fool's good sense. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin a different kind of thaw had begun. Luke felt it in the way the familiar silence of his solitude had shifted, become something else. Something he hadn't felt since Sarah died, the weight of responsibility for another soul. He glanced at Riley, now sleeping fitfully under the blankets. Whatever trouble followed her, it would have to reckon with him first. The thought should have annoyed him. He'd chosen this life of isolation for good reasons. But as he watched the fire's shadows dance on the cabin walls, Luke realized the decision had already been made. Perhaps the moment he'd heard her cry in the snow. The wind continued its mournful song outside, but for the first time in years, Luke's cabin felt less like a fortress against the world and more like what it was meant to be, a shelter, a place of refuge. Whether that change was welcome or not remained to be seen, but for tonight, it was enough. Riley murmured something in her sleep, her hand protectively curved over her unborn child. Luke added another log to the fire and settled in for a long night's watch, his thoughts turning to the morning to come and what it might bring. The storm would pass, as storms do, but its consequences would linger far longer than the snow. The night deepened, and Luke kept his vigil. Each crackle of the fire, each moan of wind against the cabin walls, reminded him that sometimes mercy came disguised as interruption, and redemption often arrived uninvited. He'd spent years building walls against both, but tonight, watching over a stranger and her unborn child, those walls didn't seem quite so sturdy anymore. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Through the cabin's single window, only white could be seen, a thick curtain of swirling snow that erased the world beyond. Luke kept the fire well fed, adding logs at regular intervals while Riley slept fitfully in his bed. Her bruises had darkened overnight, painting ugly shadows across her face and arms. When she stirred, pain crinkled the corners of her eyes, but she didn't complain. Luke had seen enough injuries to know she was hurting more than she let on. "Need to check those ribs," he said gruffly as he brought her a cup of hot broth. "Make sure. Nothing's broken." Riley hesitated, then nodded. Luke's weathered hands were gentle as he probed her sides, his touch clinical and respectful. She winced several times but shook her head when he asked if anything felt broken. "Just bruised, I think," she said softly. "They mostly kicked my legs and back." Luke's jaw tightened at that, but he kept his anger in check. "You'll be stiff for a while. Best to rest here until the storm passes." He paused, then added, "Bed's yours. I'll take the chair." "I can't put you out of your own bed," Riley protested, but Luke was already turning away. "Ain't putting me anywhere. Chair suits me fine." The cabin was spare but meticulously maintained. While Riley rested, Luke moved about his daily tasks with practiced efficiency. He mended traps at a small workbench, his calloused fingers working the wire with surprising dexterity. Everything had its place. Tools hung in neat rows, supplies stacked with military precision, floor swept clean despite the weather. Yet there was something missing, Riley thought. The cabin felt hollow somehow. No decorations adorned the walls, no personal touches softened the practical space. It was a shelter, not a home. A place where someone existed rather than lived. By evening of the first day, Riley felt strong enough to sit up properly. Luke served a thick soup he'd made from dried meat and vegetables, the warm scent filling the cabin's confines. "This is wonderful," Riley said after her first spoonful. "Thank you." Luke merely nodded, focused on his own bowl. "I'm headed to Dry River," she offered after a while, breaking the long silence. Luke's spoon paused briefly, but he didn't look up. "Rough country out that way." "Yes, I know." Riley's hand drifted to her middle. "But I have to go there." The silence stretched between them. Luke didn't ask why, and Riley didn't elaborate. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's sturdy walls. "Much obliged for the rescue," Riley said softly, "and the kindness after." Luke's shoulders stiffened slightly. "Don't make more of it than it is," he said, rising to take their empty bowls. "Any decent man would have done the same." That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Riley explored the cabin by the fire's dim light. There wasn't much to see. A few books, some newspapers from Cannon City, basic supplies. But on a high shelf, almost hidden in shadow, she spotted something that made her pause. A Bible, its leather cover thick with dust. Beside it lay a photograph, the edges worn soft with handling. Riley carefully lifted it down, bringing it closer to the firelight. A woman smiled up from the faded image. She was young and pretty, with kind eyes and dark hair styled in the fashion of 15 or 20 years past. The way she looked at the photographer spoke of love, of joy, of a future full of promise. Luke's wife, Riley realized. The woman's absence explained so much about the cabin's emptiness, about the silence that seemed to weigh on its occupant, like a physical thing. Carefully returning the photograph, Riley kept the Bible in her hands. Its pages fell open naturally to the Book of Psalms, the spine creased from frequent reading. But the dust told its own story. It had been years since anyone had sought comfort from these pages. Riley sank to her knees beside Luke's chair, the Bible cradled in her lap. In the firelight, she could see her rescuer's face in repose, years of hardship etched in every line. Even in sleep, he looked burdened. Closing her eyes, Riley began to pray. She prayed for the soul of the woman in the photograph, for the man who had saved her life, for the child growing beneath her heart. She prayed for guidance and protection, for healing of wounds both visible and hidden. "Lord," she whispered, "help him find his way back to you, and help me be worthy of the mercy you've shown through him." The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the storm, a coyote called, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in the cabin. But as Riley continued her quiet prayers, that emptiness felt less absolute somehow. Like the first hint of dawn in a long night, something was changing. Luke stirred in his chair but didn't wake. Riley carefully returned the Bible to its shelf, her fingertips lingering on its worn cover. Then she made her way back to the borrowed bed, pulling the warm quilts around her. The storm raged on outside, but within the cabin's walls, a different kind of weather was shifting. As Riley drifted off to sleep, her hand resting protectively over her unborn child, she felt an inexplicable sense of peace. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for this moment at least, they were safe. A small island of warmth in the vast, cold night. The second day passed, much like the first. Luke worked on his traps, speaking little but always aware of his guests' needs. He kept the fire strong, made sure Riley ate well, and changed the cool cloths he'd placed on her worst bruises. His movements were efficient but careful, as if he was consciously holding himself at a distance. Riley spent much of the day watching the snow through the window, lost in thought. She clutched her own Bible close, the one thing she'd managed to keep with her when she fled. Its pages held more than just scripture, but she wasn't ready to share those secrets. Not yet. The silence between them was mostly comfortable, broken only by the necessary exchanges of daily life. It was a strange sort of peace, built on unasked questions and unspoken stories. But it was peace nonetheless, and after what Riley had been through, she was grateful for it. As evening approached again, the storm's fury began to lessen. The wind's howl softened to a moan, and the thick curtain of snow thinned enough to see shadows of trees beyond the window. Tomorrow, Riley knew, she would have to leave this sanctuary and face whatever waited on the trail to Dry River. But that was tomorrow. For now, she sat in the circle of firelight, listening to the quiet sounds of Luke working at his bench, and felt something she hadn't expected to find in this remote cabin. Hope. Small and fragile as a newly kindled flame, but hope nonetheless. Luke glanced up from his work, catching her eye for a moment before looking away. In that brief contact, Riley saw something shift in his expression. A crack in the careful wall he'd built around himself. It was gone in an instant, but she had seen it. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm continued its slow retreat, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, two wounded souls waited out the night, each carrying their own burdens, their own secrets, their own prayers. Morning broke clear and brilliant over the mountains, the storm's fury replaced by pristine silence. Sunlight sparkled off fresh snow that blanketed everything in sight. The transformation was complete. What had been threatening darkness just hours ago was now a world made new. Luke stood at his cabin door, coffee cup steaming in the crisp air. His eyes tracked the pristine snow, noting where drifts had formed against trees and how the wind had sculpted cornices along the ridge. The temperature had dropped after the storm, turning the snow's surface to a glittering crust. Behind him, Riley moved carefully around the cabin, gathering her few belongings. Her bruises had faded from angry purple to mottled yellow-green, but she still winced when she reached for her shawl. "You ought to rest another day," Luke said, not turning around. "Trail's treacherous after a storm like that." "I can't." Riley's voice was firm, despite its softness. "I've lost too much time already." Luke set his cup down with deliberate care. "Dry River's a good 20 miles through rough country. In your condition, I have to go." She stepped up beside him, squinting at the brilliant landscape. "But I thank you for your concern." Luke studied her profile, noting the determination in her jaw, the way she unconsciously cradled her middle. Everything about her bearing told him arguing would be useless. Still, he couldn't just let her walk out into that wilderness alone. "I'll saddle old Jack," he said finally. "My mule. He's steady in deep snow. I can escort you part way at least." Riley opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. "That's very kind. Ain't kindness, just sense." Luke pulled on his heavy coat. "Give me 10 minutes." In the barn, as Luke worked at the mule's straps and buckles, he tried to ignore the unease growing in his gut. Something about this woman's presence had stirred up memories he'd spent years burying. The way she'd prayed last night, he'd heard her soft words even though he'd pretended sleep, reminded him too much of Sarah. His Sarah, gone these 12 years. When he led old Jack around to the cabin's front, Riley was waiting with a small bundle of provisions he'd insisted she take. She looked even smaller in the vast white landscape, but her spine was straight, her chin high. "Before we go," she said, "there's something you should see." She reached into her coat and withdrew an envelope, worn soft at the creases from frequent handling. Luke took it, noting the familiar spidery handwriting on the front. His name, his full name, was written there in fading ink. "Reverend Harlan?" he muttered, recognizing the hand. "From Boulder?" Riley nodded. "He gave me this when he sent me to find you." Luke's fingers felt numb as he opened the letter. The paper was thin, covered in the same careful script. "Dear Luke, I pray this finds you well, though I know you've walked far from God's grace these past years. A soul in desperate need requires your help. The bearer of this letter, Miss Riley Quinn. I ask you to shelter her through her hour of travail, as Christ sheltered the Holy Family in their time of need. I know you question providence, old friend, but perhaps this is the Lord's way of leading you home. In His name, Reverend Thomas Harlan." Luke read it twice, then a third time. His hands shook slightly. "I never told anyone where I settled, not even him." "I didn't know that," Riley said quietly. "He just gave me directions and said I'd find help here." "Help?" Luke's laugh was harsh. "Been a long time since I was any help to anyone." "That's not true." Riley's voice was gentle but firm. "You helped me." Luke folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his coat pocket. The Reverend's words seemed to burn there against his chest. Thomas Harlan had been Sarah's preacher, had conducted her funeral when the fever took her. He'd tried to counsel Luke afterward, but Luke had already been halfway to turning his back on everything: faith, community, hope itself. And now this. This letter, this woman, this impossible coincidence that felt more like judgment. "Did he tell you anything about me?" Luke asked roughly. "About why he'd send you here?" Riley shook her head. "Only that I'd find safety. I didn't question further. I needed to leave quickly." Those railroad men, Luke thought, the ones he'd driven off in the storm. What had she done to earn their violence? What was she running from? The questions crowded his mind, but he couldn't voice them. Not yet. "Well," he said finally, "best get moving if we're going to make any distance before midday." He helped Riley mount old Jack, making sure she was secure in the saddle. The mule's steady gait would be easier on her than walking, though it meant Luke would have to break trail on foot. He didn't mind. Physical effort would help quiet the thoughts hammering at him. They set out single file, Luke leading the mule by its bridle. The snow was deep but manageable where wind had packed it. Luke chose their path carefully, avoiding drifts and staying close to the tree line where the footing was better. For the first hour, neither spoke. The only sounds were their breathing, the crunch of snow under boots and hooves, and the occasional crack of an ice-laden branch. But Luke could feel the weight of that letter in his pocket, heavy as stone. Reverend Harlan's words echoed in his mind. "Perhaps this is the Lord's way of leading you home." Home. He'd made his home in the wilderness precisely because it demanded nothing of him. No faith, no connection, no responsibility beyond survival. He'd thought himself free of all that. But now... "He used to speak of you sometimes," Riley said suddenly, breaking into his thoughts. "The Reverend, he said you were a man of principle before..." "Before what?" Luke's voice was sharp. "He didn't say. It wasn't my place to ask." Luke walked on in silence for several more minutes before speaking again. "Sarah, my wife, she was in his congregation 12 years ago, before the fever took her." "I'm sorry," Riley said softly. "Been a long time." Luke's tone made it clear he didn't want to discuss it further. But the memories came anyway, unwanted. Sarah in their little house in Boulder, reading her Bible by lamplight. Sarah tending her garden, singing hymns under her breath. Sarah in their bed, burning with fever, still trying to comfort him, even as she slipped away. Sarah in her pine box, while Reverend Harlan spoke of God's mysterious ways. Luke had left town the day after the funeral. He'd walked away from everything. His work as a scout, his few friendships, his faith. He'd built this new life in the high country, where the only things that mattered were what a man could see and touch and understand. And now this letter had found him anyway. This woman had found him, carrying not just her own burden, but the weight of memory, of obligation, of things he'd thought long buried. The sun climbed higher as they made their way through the transformed landscape. Luke knew these mountains in all seasons, but today they seemed different, charged with meaning he didn't want to acknowledge. Every glinting snowfield, every stark tree seemed to watch him, waiting to see what he would do. Riley sat straight in the saddle despite her injuries, one hand on the reins, the other resting protective over her unborn child. There was something about her quiet dignity that reminded him painfully of Sarah. Perhaps that's what the Reverend had seen, some echo of the past that might wake what was sleeping in Luke's soul. Or perhaps it was punishment, Luke thought darkly. Divine retribution for his years of turning away, for abandoning the faith that had meant everything to Sarah. Being forced to face this woman's need, to remember what it meant to be responsible for another's welfare. It felt like a reckoning. The sound of old Jack's steady breathing and plodding hooves continued to mark their progress through the morning. Luke led them along the safest paths, his woodsman's instincts working automatically, while his mind wrestled with unwanted questions. Why had Reverend Harlan kept track of him all these years? How had the preacher known where to send Riley? And most troubling of all, what was he supposed to do now that she was here? The letter had asked him to shelter her through her hour of travail. That meant weeks, maybe months. The thought of sharing his carefully ordered solitude for so long made him uneasy. But the alternative, sending her away, alone and vulnerable, sat even worse in his conscience. He touched the letter in his pocket again, feeling the worn paper through his coat. Whatever game Providence was playing with him, he was caught in it now. The only question was whether he would accept it with grace or continue fighting against the current that had brought Riley to his door. They continued on through the pristine morning, each lost in their own thoughts, while the sun climbed higher over the snow-covered peaks. The mountains kept their counsel, and somewhere ahead lay decisions neither of them was quite ready to face. Luke's boots crunched through the crusty snow as he led old Jack higher into the timberline. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines, and his breath clouded in the crisp mountain air. He needed firewood, and game if he could find it. Having another mouth to feed meant his usual stores wouldn't last. He tried not to think about how Riley's presence had already changed things, how her quiet gratitude made his isolation feel suddenly stark, how her careful movements around his cabin reminded him of another woman long ago. The mule plodded steadily beside him, pulling the small sledge Luke used for hauling wood. Near a stand of dead pines, he stopped and unshouldered his axe. The dry wood would burn hot and clean. As he worked, his muscles warming to the familiar rhythm, he spotted movement in the underbrush. Rabbits, grown fat on winter bark. Setting his axe aside, Luke drew his rifle. The first shot dropped a snowshoe hare clean. The second scattered the rest, but he'd already gotten what he needed. He tied the rabbit to his belt and returned to chopping wood until the sledge was full. The sun was sinking toward the peaks when he finally turned homeward. Home. The word caught in his mind like a burr. When had his cabin last felt like a home? Not since Sarah. The smell hit him before he cleared the trees. Beans simmering with salt pork. For a moment, the scent stopped him cold. How many years since he'd returned to cooking waiting for him? Smoke curled from his chimney into the purple dusk. Through the window, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. Luke's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. Inside, Riley stood at his hearth, stirring the bean pot. She'd swept the plank floor clean, straightened his few dishes on their shelf, and somehow made his sparse cabin feel different, lived in, cared for. "I hope you don't mind," she said, glancing up. "I found the beans in your storehouse, and I wanted to do something useful." Luke grunted, unsettled by how natural she looked there. He busied himself hanging up the rabbit and stowing his gear. "Didn't have to do that," he said finally. "I know." Riley ladled beans into 2 tin bowls. "But I wanted to." They sat at his rough-hewn table, the lamp casting soft shadows. Luke couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal with anyone. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the clink of spoons and the pop of burning wood. "This is good," he said gruffly, surprised to find he meant it. Riley smiled slightly. "My mother taught me to cook. She said a meal's not worth eating if it's not worth sharing." Luke focused on his bowl, trying to ignore how that simple statement pricked at his conscience. How long had he lived without sharing anything? "Your wife," Riley's voice was hesitant. "Did she like to cook too?" Luke's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. For a moment, he considered not answering. But something in Riley's gentle tone made the words come. "Sarah was a fine cook, better than fine. Used to say the same thing as your mother, about sharing." He set his spoon down carefully. "Been 10 winters since the fever took her." "I'm sorry," Riley said softly. "It must have been very hard." Luke stared into the fire. "Lost more than just her. Lost my faith. My way. Turned bitter as winter bark." He didn't know why he was telling her this, but the words kept coming. "Couldn't see the point anymore, in any of it." Riley was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Bitterness only kills the living, Mr. Redden. The dead are beyond its reach." Luke's head snapped up, but there was no judgment in her face, only understanding, and something that might have been compassion. "What do you know about it?" he asked roughly. "Enough." She touched her swollen belly unconsciously. "Enough to know that holding on to hurt doesn't heal it. It just spreads the poison." Luke pushed back from the table abruptly. "Need to check the stock," he muttered, though he'd already done so earlier. Outside, the night air was knife-sharp with cold. The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant and distant. Luke drew deep breaths until his pulse steadied. Riley's words had cut too close to truths he'd been avoiding for years. How his bitterness had become a wall, keeping out not just pain but everything else. Friendship, faith, the simple comfort of human connection. When he finally returned inside, Riley had already cleaned up and retired to his bed. He settled onto his pallet by the fire, but sleep was long in coming. In his dreams, Sarah's voice came to him, clear as spring water. "Luke, protect her. She needs you now." He tried to argue, to say he wasn't fit to protect anyone anymore. But Sarah's voice was gentle, insistent. "The Lord sent her to you for a reason. Don't turn away this time." Luke woke with the first gray light of dawn. The dream clung to him like morning mist. He built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, moving quietly so as not to wake Riley. As he worked, he thought about the letter from Reverend Harlan, still folded in his coat pocket. About Riley's condition and the men who'd tried to harm her. About Sarah's voice in his dream and all the years he'd spent running from everything she'd believed in. By the time Riley stirred and rose, Luke had made his decision. He waited until she'd had some coffee and a bite of breakfast before speaking. "You'll stay here," he said flatly, "until the baby comes." Riley set down her cup carefully. "Mr. Redden, I can't impose— ain't asking." Luke's tone was firm, but not unkind. "Winter's setting in hard. You're in no condition to travel, and them men might still be looking for you." "But— "No buts. Got plenty of supplies. Cabin's warm enough. You'll stay." Riley studied him for a long moment. "Why?" Luke stood and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered mountains. How could he explain about Sarah's voice in his dreams? About the way Riley's presence had already begun to thaw something he'd thought frozen solid? "Because it's right," he said finally, "and I've spent too long doing what's easy instead of what's right." He heard Riley's soft intake of breath, but he kept his eyes on the landscape outside. The morning sun was touching the peaks now, turning the snow to gold. "Thank you," Riley said quietly. Luke nodded once, still not looking at her. "Got work to do," he said, and headed for the door. But as he stepped out into the crisp morning air, he felt lighter somehow, as if some burden he'd carried for years had begun to ease. He didn't understand it, didn't want to understand it if he was honest, but he couldn't deny it was there. The decision to shelter Riley wasn't just about protecting her, he realized. It was about finally opening the door he'd slammed shut 10 years ago, about letting something other than bitterness take root in his life again. He wasn't sure he was ready for what that might mean, but for the first time in a very long time, he was willing to find out. Days stretched like taffy in the mountain winter. Luke rose before dawn, as he always had, but now the cabin held more than just his solitary breath. The soft sounds of Riley sleeping, the rustle of blankets as she turned, gave the morning hours a different texture. He'd stoke the fire first thing, moving quiet as a shadow. Sometimes he'd catch himself pausing, watching the flames catch and grow, listening to the peaceful rhythm of her breathing. It unsettled him, How quickly he'd grown used to another presence in his space. Riley proved herself useful, though he hadn't asked it of her. She kept the cabin tidy, making his sparse belongings seem more like a home than just shelter. Her hands were never idle. She mended clothes with neat, careful stitches, humming hymns under her breath while she worked. Songs he hadn't heard since Sarah passed. Amazing grace. What a friend we have in Jesus. Filled the quiet hours. The first time he recognized a tune, he nearly dropped his coffee cup. Riley had been patching one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the morning light, when the melody of Rock of Ages drifted across the room. For a moment, he was back in that little church in Boulder, Sarah's shoulder warm against his as they sang together. Riley must have noticed his stillness. The humming stopped. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Does it bother you?" Luke cleared his throat. "No," he said roughly. "Just been a while since I heard them songs?" She nodded and resumed her work, but the humming didn't return that day. Luke found himself missing it, though he couldn't say why. Each evening, as supper time approached, Riley would take his old Bible from its shelf. The leather was cracked with age, the pages yellow and dog-eared. She'd settle in her chair by the fire and read aloud, her voice clear and steady in the gathering dark. Luke made a show of ignoring it, occupying himself with mending traps or cleaning his rifle. But the words reached him anyway, familiar as his own heartbeat. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He told himself he was just being polite, letting her read. It meant nothing that he found himself timing his work to finish just as she began, or that he'd positioned his chair where he could hear better while pretending not to listen. One morning, as Luke pulled on his coat to check his trap lines, Riley spoke up from where she was washing breakfast dishes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for letting me stay." Luke shrugged into his other sleeve, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Just until spring," he muttered. "Ain't safe for you to travel now." "All the same." She dried her hands on her apron. "I'm grateful." He nodded stiffly and reached for the door, but she wasn't finished. Would you mind if I came with you today, to check the traps?" Her hands twisted in her apron. "I know I'll be slower, but I'd like to help if I can." Luke's first instinct was to refuse. He'd worked alone for so long, the thought of adjusting his pace for another person made him bristle. But something in her expression stopped him, a mixture of hope and determination that reminded him of Sarah. "Be cold out there," he said finally, "and deep snow." "I'm stronger than I look." Riley's chin lifted slightly. "And I have warm clothes." Luke studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Get your coat then, and mind you stay close." The morning was knife-sharp and brilliant, the sun turning every snow-laden branch to diamond. Their breath plumed white in the still air as they made their way through the trees. Luke found himself automatically shortening his stride, matching his pace to Riley's careful steps. She didn't complain about the cold or the difficulty, though he could see her breathing harder as they climbed. When they reached his first trap line, she watched attentively as he demonstrated how to check each snare without disturbing the set. "The trick is to move slow and deliberate," he explained, surprised to hear himself teaching. "Quick movements spook the game." Riley nodded, her cheeks pink with cold and exertion. "Like this?" She carefully reset a spring-loaded trap the way he'd shown her. "That's right." Luke found himself almost smiling at her earnest concentration. "You're getting the hang of it." They worked their way along the line, Luke checking the traps while Riley marked their locations in the snow with broken branches. The work took longer with two, but he found he didn't mind. There was something peaceful about sharing the task. When they finally turned back toward the cabin, the sun was high and Riley was visibly tired. Luke noticed her stumble once, then again. Without a word, he took her arm, steadying her through the deeper drifts. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm not used to such long walks." "Should have said something sooner," he grunted. "No shame in needing help." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Luke noticed Riley's mittens were torn along one seam. Without thinking, he held out his hand. "Give 'em here," he said gruffly. "I'll fix that." Riley blinked in surprise but handed them over. Luke took out his mending kit, needle, thread, and beeswax, and began carefully stitching the torn seam by firelight. His stitches weren't as neat as Riley's, but they were strong and even. "I didn't know you could sew," Riley said, watching him work. Luke tied off a knot. "Man living alone needs to know how to mend things." He paused, then added quietly, "Sarah taught me. Said every skill was worth learning." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Luke focused on his stitching, but the memories came anyway. Sarah teaching him to sew by candlelight, laughing at his clumsy first attempts, her patient hands guiding his, showing him how to make the thread strong and true. He finished the mittens in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. When he handed them back to Riley, she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, and he knew she meant more than just the mending. That night, as Luke lay on his pallet by the fire, he listened to Riley's soft breathing from his bed across the room. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, despite the winter wind that whistled around the eaves. He thought about how naturally they'd fallen into a rhythm these past days, how Riley's presence had filled empty spaces he hadn't even known were there, how her hymns and Bible readings had awakened echoes of a faith he'd thought long dead. It scared him, this gradual thawing. He'd built his walls carefully over the years, brick by bitter brick, but now there were cracks appearing, letting in light and warmth he wasn't sure he was ready for. Yet as he drifted toward sleep, he found himself humming one of Riley's hymns under his breath. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The tune followed him into his dreams, where Sarah smiled at him from a sunlit church doorway, and the path before him was clear of snow. The winter moon hung like a silver dollar in the black Colorado sky. Inside Luke's cabin, the fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. For 7 peaceful days, he and Riley had fallen into an easy rhythm of shared tasks and quiet companionship. Luke stirred in his bedroll by the hearth, half awake. Something had disturbed his sleep, a sound unlike the usual night noises of settling timber and prowling animals. Then he heard it, a whimper from the bed where Riley slept, followed by thrashing movements. "No, the papers." Her voice was thick with terror. "Please, don't." Luke sat up, instantly alert. Riley's nightmare-twisted words grew more frantic. "The deeds! Stop! You can't burn them!" Her scream pierced the darkness. "They'll kill everyone!" Luke crossed the room in 3 long strides. Riley was tangled in her blankets, face contorted in fear, still trapped in her dream. "Miss Riley." He kept his voice low and steady, not touching her. "Miss Riley, wake up now. You're safe." Her eyes flew open, wild and unseeing. She scrambled backward until she hit the cabin wall, arms raised as if to ward off a blow. "Easy now," Luke murmured. "You're in my cabin. Nobody here but us." Slowly, awareness crept back into her eyes. Riley lowered her arms, trembling. "Mr. Redden?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Right here." He stepped back, giving her space. "Want me to light the lamp?" She nodded, drawing her knees to her chest. Luke moved to the shelf where the oil lamp sat, his movements deliberately slow and careful. The match flared bright, then settled to a steady glow as he adjusted the wick. Riley's face was pale in the lamplight, her hair tangled around her shoulders. Tear tracks glistened on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her face with shaking hands. "I didn't mean to wake you." "No need for sorry." Luke pulled a chair near the bed, but not too near. "Bad dream?" She tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Just memories, I suppose." Her hands went protectively to her swollen belly. "Sometimes they catch up to a person in the dark." Luke waited, saying nothing. The fire popped and settled behind him. Finally, Riley spoke again, her voice barely audible. "There are bad men. They think I know too much." She twisted the blanket between her fingers. "That's all I can say. I don't want to put you in danger too." Luke thought of the bruises that had marked her body when he found her, the terror in her voice when she screamed about burning papers and land deeds. A cold anger settled in his gut. "Already in it?" he said quietly. "Moment I took you in." Fresh tears welled in Riley's eyes. "I never meant—" "Hush now." Luke's voice was gruff but gentle. "What's done is done. Try to rest." He stayed in the chair until her breathing evened out, and she drifted back to sleep. Then he moved silently to the cabin door, checking the heavy bar that secured it. His Winchester rifle hung on pegs nearby. He took it down, verified it was loaded, and propped it within easy reach. Dawn came clear and cold. Luke woke to find Riley already up, stirring porridge over the fire. If her face was drawn and tired, neither of them mentioned it. After breakfast, Luke pulled on his coat. "Need more firewood?" he said. "Won't be far." Riley nodded, already gathering dishes to wash. "I'll tend things here." The morning air was sharp in his lungs as Luke swung his axe, the rhythm of chopping helping to order his thoughts. Whatever trouble followed Riley, it was bigger than just a woman running from shame or an angry husband. Land deeds, burning papers. It smelled of the kind of corruption he'd seen during his scouting days, when powerful men rewrote maps and treaties to suit themselves. A sound caught his attention. Water splashing behind the cabin. Luke set down his axe and moved quietly around the corner. Riley knelt by the wash basin, scrubbing frantically at the hem of a dress. The water had turned pink with old blood. Her fingers were red from the cold and the harsh soap, but she kept scrubbing, as if trying to erase more than just stains. Luke watched for a moment, his heart heavy. How long had she carried these secrets? How many nights had she lain awake, jumping at shadows? He cleared his throat to announce his presence. Riley started, almost dropping the dress. "Water's too cold for washing," he said, pretending not to notice her embarrassment. "Get inside before you freeze your fingers." "I just needed to—" She gestured helplessly at the bloody dress. "Leave it." Luke picked up the basin. "I'll dump this and bring fresh water for later, when it's warmed." Riley's shoulders slumped. "Thank you," she whispered. Back inside, Luke added wood to the fire, while Riley hung the damp dress to dry. Neither spoke of the bloodstains, but they hung between them like an unfinished prayer. The day passed slowly. Luke split more wood than they needed, his muscles burning with the effort. Every sound from the forest made him tense, expecting trouble. But only winter birds and the occasional deer moved through the trees. As evening approached, Riley took out the Bible for their usual reading. But tonight, her voice faltered on the words. After a few verses, she closed the book. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't, not tonight." Luke nodded, understanding. Some nights, words of comfort felt too far away to reach. After Riley went to bed, Luke remained by the fire. The Winchester gleamed dully in the firelight where he'd propped it by the door. Ready. A lifetime of memories pressed in on him. Sarah's death, when he'd turned his back on God. Years of scout work, watching good men die while the wicked prospered. His self-imposed exile in these mountains, where he'd thought to escape the world's darkness. But now here was Riley, carrying her own darkness, trusting him to keep her safe. And for the first time in years, Luke felt the weight of something greater than himself. Slowly, stiffly, he lowered himself to his knees beside the hearth. The words came rusty and uncertain. "Lord," his voice caught. "Lord, I ain't talked to you in a long time. Don't even know if you're listening anymore." The fire crackled softly. Somewhere in the night, an owl called. "But that girl needs—" Luke's throat closed around the words. He couldn't finish. Instead, he knelt there in silence, head bowed. The prayer hung incomplete in the darkness, like the bloody dress Riley had tried to wash clean. Some stains, he knew, ran too deep for soap and water. Some wounds needed a stronger medicine. Finally, Luke rose and checked the door bar one last time. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For tonight, he could only keep watch and remember how it felt to kneel in prayer after so many years of standing alone. As he settled into his bedroll, Riley's breathing was steady and peaceful. No more nightmares, at least for now. Luke lay awake for a long time, one hand near the rifle, listening to the wind in the pines and wondering what kind of men would drive a pregnant woman into the winter mountains to die. The moon sailed high and cold above the cabin. Inside, 2 people slept, one running from darkness, one standing guard against it, and between them, an unfinished prayer waited like a seed in frozen ground, ready to grow when spring came. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when Luke heard horses approaching. He was outside splitting wood, and the sound made him freeze mid-swing. 3 distinct gaits, moving steady but not rushed. Not hunters, then. Hunters would be quieter. He set the axe down carefully and moved toward the cabin door. "Riley," he called softly through the crack. "Get in the back room, quick now!" She must have heard the urgency in his voice because she didn't question him. Luke heard her soft footsteps retreating just as 3 riders emerged from the tree line. They wore heavy winter coats with railroad company badges pinned to their lapels. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a week's worth of dark beard, pulled his horse to a stop in the yard. "Morning," the man called out, his tone friendly enough, though his eyes were sharp. "Hope we ain't disturbing you too early." Luke leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, keeping his posture relaxed while staying close to where his rifle waited inside. "Bit far from the railroad for company men." The bearded man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We go where duty calls. Name's Morris. These here are Jenkins and Tate." He gestured to his companions. "We're looking for a runaway clerk. Young woman, dark hair, might be in a family way. Seen anybody matching that description?" "No women up here," Luke said evenly. "Just me and the wildlife." Morris's smile faded slightly. "That right? And you would be—" "Luke Redden." The name caused a ripple of recognition among the men. Jenkins, a thin-faced man with a patchy mustache, let out a dry laugh. "Redden? The hermit scout? Heard tell you'd gone strange after the war, hiding up here in the hills?" Luke kept his face neutral, though his jaw tightened. "I mind my own business." "That so?" Morris leaned forward in his saddle. "Well, Mr. Redden, might want to mind this piece of business. That girl we're looking for, she took some company property when she ran. Important papers. Railroad takes a dim view of theft. Like I said, Luke repeated carefully, haven't seen any woman. The third man, Tate, spoke up for the first time. His voice was soft, but carried an edge of menace. Helping fugitives ain't Christian, friend, especially not thieves. Luke met his gaze steadily. Appreciate the sermon. Now if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do. Morris studied him for a long moment, then straightened in his saddle. Course, man's got to earn his keep. He gathered his reins. We'll be watching the trails. You see our missing clerk. You let the station master in Cannon City know. Railroad rewards honest folks who help maintain order. I'll bear that in mind. The three men wheeled their horses around, but Morris paused to look back. One more thing, Mr. Redden. If someone was harboring a fugitive up here, well, winter's a dangerous time. Accidents happen. Cabins burn. Bodies get lost in the snow. Would be a shame for a man to risk his neck over someone else's troubles. Luke said nothing, just watched as they rode away. He waited until the sound of hooves faded completely before going inside. Riley emerged from the back room, her face pale. They're looking for me. Figured as much. Luke checked his rifle, then moved to the window to scan the tree line. Reckon it's time you told me what kind of trouble you're really in. Riley sank into a chair by the fire, one hand pressed against her belly as if to steady herself. I worked in the land office at Cannon City, she began softly. Keeping records, filing deeds. At first, everything seemed proper. But then I started noticing discrepancies in the water rights documents. Luke turned from the window to listen as she continued. They were forging deeds, changing dates and property lines, taking water access from honest settlers and Ute families who had legal claims. Her voice shook with anger. The railroad's been buying up land all through the territory, but they want the water most of all. Without water rights, people can't farm or ranch. They have to sell for whatever price they're offered. And you found proof? Luke asked. Riley nodded. Original deeds, letters showing who ordered the forgeries. I couldn't just stand by while they robbed people of their livelihood. She reached for the Bible that sat on the shelf near her chair. Opening it carefully, she showed Luke where several pages had been hollowed out to create a hiding place. Inside lay folded papers, their edges worn. When I tried to take the evidence to the territorial judge, they caught me. Railroad men, led by Foreman Moran himself, beat me and left me for dead in an alley. Her hand drifted to her side, where Luke knew bruises still lingered. But God sent help. A washerwoman found me, helped me hide until I could travel. She had kin in Boulder who knew Reverend Harlan. And the Reverend sent you to me. Luke's voice was rough with suppressed anger. Not at Riley, but at the men who'd hurt her. Yes. Riley's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry for bringing danger to your door. Those men today, they'll be back. Luke moved away from the window and knelt by the fire, adding another log, though it didn't need it. The familiar task helped him think. When I was scouting during the war, he said slowly, I saw plenty of men who wrapped greed in fancy words like progress and civilization. Called it God's will when they took what wasn't theirs. He looked up at Riley. Lost my taste for it. Lost my faith, too, for a long while. And now? Riley asked softly. Luke was quiet for a moment, remembering his unfinished prayer the night before. Now I reckon maybe the Lord's giving me a chance to make something right. He stood, decision made. I swore to protect you. That ain't changed. We'll figure something out. Relief and gratitude washed over Riley's face, but worry quickly followed. The baby's coming soon. I can feel it. And when the snow melts, we'll deal with that when it comes, Luke assured her, though his own gut churned with fear and anger at their situation. The railroad was powerful. Its men were ruthless, and spring would bring more than just melting snow. It would bring more searchers, more threats. He moved to check the door's heavy bar, then the shutters on each window, small actions of protection that felt terribly inadequate against the forces gathering against them. But he'd meant what he said. Whatever came, he would keep his word. Riley watched him, her hands clasped around her Bible. "Luke," she said quietly, "thank you. Not just for taking me in, but for believing me." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The truth of her story sat heavy in his chest. The corruption she'd uncovered, the violence she'd endured, the justice she still sought. It was larger than both of them. This fight against powerful men who twisted law and faith to serve their greed. But as Luke looked at Riley, somehow both fragile and fierce with her precious evidence hidden in Scripture, he felt something stir in his soul. Something he'd thought long dead. Not just anger at evil, but hope. Hope that right might still triumph over wrong. Hope that one person's courage could light the way for others. He picked up his rifle and began cleaning it, each movement precise and practiced. Outside, the winter wind moaned through the pines, carrying the promise of another storm. But inside the cabin, two people held their ground. A woman who'd risked everything for truth, and a man, rediscovering what it meant to stand for something larger than himself. The railroad men's threats hung in the air like smoke, but Luke's resolve was as solid as the mountain stone beneath their feet. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The December snows came hard and deep, blanketing Luke's mountain homestead in pristine white. Each morning, the drifts climbed higher against the cabin walls, and Luke's daily trek to the woodpile grew more challenging. Still, he kept at it methodically, knowing that both the pregnant Riley and her coming child would need plenty of warmth in the weeks ahead. Luke's axe bit deep into a pine log, sending chips flying. The rhythmic thunk of steel against wood echoed through the crisp mountain air. He paused to wipe his brow, his breath forming clouds in the cold. From inside the cabin, the smell of baking bread drifted out. Riley making use of the flour left by Ute traders who'd passed through last week. The traders had been surprised to find a woman in Luke's cabin, but had accepted his brief explanation that she was family. They'd traded fairly, leaving flour, dried berries, and some fresh deer meat in exchange for Luke's prime pelts. More importantly, they'd brought news that railroad men were still asking questions down in Cannon City. Luke split another log, his movements precise and practiced. The growing woodpile would see them through the winter, but his thoughts kept turning to spring, and to the baby that would arrive long before then. Riley was close now, her steps slower, her hand often pressed to her lower back as she moved around the cabin. When he'd gathered enough wood for the day, Luke carried an armload inside. The cabin's warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, along with the homey smell of baking bread. Riley stood at the rough-hewn table, her fingers dusted with flour as she worked the dough. "Smells good," Luke said, stacking the wood by the hearth. Riley smiled, though he could see the tiredness in her eyes. "It won't be fancy, but it'll fill our bellies." She pressed a hand to her swollen middle. "This little one seems to want me eating all the time now." Luke nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Been working on something, in the shed." He cleared his throat. "Might as well show you." Riley followed him to the small workshop attached to the cabin's north side. There, carefully wrapped in an old blanket, stood a cradle made of pine. Luke had spent weeks on it, working in the evenings by lamplight, smoothing every edge until the wood felt like silk beneath his fingers. "Oh, Luke." Riley's eyes filled with tears as she ran her hand along the curved headboard. "It's beautiful. He shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. Needed something for the little one to sleep in. As he turned to go, Riley caught his arm. I heard you while you were making it. The song you were humming. Luke stilled. He hadn't even realized he'd been humming Sarah's favorite hymn while he worked. His late wife had loved Amazing Grace, used to sing it while she quilted or cooked. The melody had come back to him unbidden as he'd worked the wood. Sarah loved that song, he said quietly. Riley squeezed his arm gently. She'd be proud of you, Luke, of the man you are. He couldn't answer, just nodded and went back to his chores. But that evening, as they sat by the fire, he found himself humming the old tune again while Riley sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric. The days grew shorter as Christmas approached. Luke had lost track of dates years ago, but Riley kept count carefully in her Bible. On December 24th, she baked the last of the trader's flour into hard bread while Luke chopped extra wood, both of them preparing for the coming holy day without discussing it. As evening fell, Luke lit the cabin's lanterns. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Riley settled in her usual chair by the fire. She'd been unusually quiet all day, her face drawn with discomfort. You all right? Luke asked, noting how she pressed both hands to her belly. I think... Riley took a deep breath. I think the baby's coming. Luke's heart jumped into his throat. Now? You sure? She nodded, a flicker of fear crossing her face. Been having pains since morning. They're getting stronger. Luke forced himself to think clearly. He'd helped birth countless animals over the years, but this was different. This was a human child, Riley's child. What do you need? Water, Riley said, her voice tight with another pain. Lots of boiling water, and the clean linens we set aside. Luke moved quickly, filling pots with snow to melt and heating water over the fire. He brought Riley the linens they'd prepared and helped her arrange blankets near the hearth where it was warmest. As her labor progressed, her pains grew stronger, and Luke found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, praying out loud. Lord, he whispered, as Riley gripped his hand through another contraction. Help us through this night. Protect them both. Hours passed. Riley's cries echoed in the small cabin as she labored. Luke supported her as best he could, wiping her brow with cool cloths, helping her walk when she needed to move, holding her hands when the pain became too much. Near midnight, as Christmas Eve became Christmas Day, Riley's labor reached its peak. Luke, she gasped between pushes, I'm scared. You're doing fine, he assured her, though his own heart pounded with fear. The good Lord's watching over us. With one final, tremendous effort, Riley pushed, and suddenly a new cry filled the cabin, the strong, healthy wail of a newborn baby. Luke's hands shook as he helped clean the tiny girl and wrap her in warm blankets. A daughter, he said softly, placing the bundle in Riley's arms. Strong and perfect. Riley's tears fell freely as she cradled her child. Grace, she whispered. Her name is Grace, because that's what brought us here. God's grace. Luke turned away, moving to tend the fire, but he couldn't stop the tears that slid down his weathered cheeks. The scene before him, mother and child bathed in lantern light on Christmas morning, stirred something deep in his soul. It was holy, this moment. Sacred. He remembered another Christmas long ago, when Sarah had still been alive. They'd dreamed of children then, but it hadn't been God's plan for them. Now, watching Riley with baby Grace, he felt his dead wife's presence strongly. Would she be pleased, he wondered, to see how life had led him here? The baby's soft coos drew him back. Riley looked up at him, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. Would you like to hold her?" Luke hesitated, then carefully took the tiny bundle. Grace's eyes, still unfocused, seemed to look right through him. Her small hand wrapped around his rough finger with surprising strength. Something inside him broke and healed all at once. "Welcome to the world, little Grace," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome home." He sat by the fire, holding the newborn while Riley rested. Outside, the winter wind sang through the pines, and fresh snow fell in the darkness. But inside the cabin, warmth and wonder filled every corner. Here was proof that mercy still lived, that grace could find even the most hidden places. Luke remembered his prayers during Riley's labor, the first prayers he'd spoken aloud in years. They'd been answered here, in this child's safe arrival, in the peace that filled the cabin, in the way his heart, so long frozen, had thawed enough to weep with joy. As Christmas morning dawned, Luke Redden held a sleeping baby and watched her mother rest by the fire. He thought of the story of another birth long ago, in a humble place, surrounded by wonder and hope. Perhaps, he reflected, some of that same wonder had found its way to this mountain cabin. Grace stirred in his arms, and Luke began to hum softly, Sarah's favorite hymn, a lullaby now for this new life. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The words echoed in his heart as the first light of Christmas Day filtered through the cabin windows, touching mother and child with gold. In that moment, Luke understood that his life would never be the same. This night had changed everything, not just with Grace's birth, but with the rebirth of something in his own soul. Faith, perhaps, or hope, or maybe both, wrapped together like the tiny girl in his arms, a Christmas gift he'd never expected to receive. The first days of the new year dawned clear and cold in the Colorado mountains. Inside Luke's cabin, Riley lay propped up on pillows, cradling baby Grace while morning light spilled through the frost-etched windows. Her face still showed the strain of childbirth, but color had begun returning to her cheeks. Luke moved quietly around the cabin, stoking the fire and preparing breakfast. He'd developed a routine over the past few days, checking his traps at dawn, chopping ice from the creek for fresh water, then mixing goat's milk with a spoonful of precious sugar for the baby. The trader who'd sold him the goat months ago had sworn it would keep a child healthy through winter. "She's taking to the milk well," Riley observed, watching Grace's tiny lips work eagerly at the cloth-wrapped feeding bottle Luke had fashioned. "Reckon so?" Luke's gruff voice held a note of pride. He'd worried the baby wouldn't thrive on goat's milk, but Grace proved strong, like her mother. "Need to fetch more ice soon. Running low." Riley shifted carefully in the bed, wincing. "I should be up helping in another day or two." "No rush," Luke said firmly. "Doc Walsh always said new mothers need rest." The words slipped out before he could catch them. He rarely spoke of the old days when he'd been married, when he'd known people like the town doctor. Riley's eyes softened with understanding. Sarah was lucky to have such a caring husband. Luke turned away, busying himself with the cooking pot. That was a long time ago. The cabin fell quiet except for Grace's soft nursing sounds and the crack of burning pine in the hearth. Outside, a jay called sharply, and Luke heard the distant crack of ice breaking on the creek. Winter held the mountains in a firm grip, but inside, warmth bloomed like a sheltered flower. Later that morning, Luke bundled up and headed to the creek with his axe and bucket. The air bit sharp and clean in his lungs as he worked, chopping through the thick ice. His thoughts drifted to New Year's morning, just days ago, when he'd awakened to find Riley already up, Grace sleeping peacefully in her pine cradle. "Happy New Year, Luke," she'd said softly, offering him a cup of coffee. He'd taken it wordlessly, But something in the simple gesture, the shared marking of time's passage, the quiet acknowledgement of new beginnings had touched him deeply. They'd spent that morning in comfortable silence, broken only by Grace's occasional coos and Riley's gentle humming. Now, as Luke hauled the ice-filled bucket back to the cabin, he found himself listening for those sounds, the baby's small noises, Riley's soft voice singing lullabies. They'd become as familiar to him as the wind in the pines or the crunch of snow under his boots. Inside, he found Riley reading her Bible while Grace slept. The cradle he'd built rocked gently with each push of Riley's foot. His eyes caught on the small wooden cross he'd whittled and attached to the headboard just yesterday. He hadn't planned to add it. His hands had simply formed the shape as he worked, memories of Sarah's faith guiding his knife. "The cross is perfect," Riley said, following his gaze, "like it was meant to be there all along." Luke nodded, unable to explain how right it had felt to place that symbol of faith above the sleeping child. Instead, he busied himself melting ice and stoking the fire. The peaceful rhythm of their days continued as January deepened. Luke trapped and hunted. Riley grew stronger and began moving carefully around the cabin. Grace thrived on the goat's milk, her tiny fingers curling tight around Luke's weathered thumb whenever he fed her. But peace, Luke had learned long ago, was as fragile as spring ice. The trader arrived on a bitter afternoon, his mule laden with supplies. Luke met him outside the cabin, not wanting to draw attention to his guests inside. But as they haggled over the price of coffee and sugar, the trader's eyes kept straying to the smoke rising from the chimney. "Heard talk in town," the trader said finally, his voice low. "Railroad men asking questions about you, Redden, saying you're harboring some criminal woman." Luke's hand tightened on his coin pouch. "That so?" The trader nodded, glancing around nervously. "Foreman himself, fellow named Moran, offering rewards for information. Claims she stole important papers, but word is she knew too much about their dealings. They mean to find her, one way or another." "Much obliged for the warning," Luke said carefully, maintaining his neutral expression. "They're spreading the word all over. Cannon City, Boulder, even up to Fort Collins." The trader shifted uncomfortably. "Thought you should know. I ain't told them nothing, but others might not be so careful." After the trader left, Luke stood in the falling snow, thinking hard. The cabin had served him well for 10 years, but it wasn't defensible. Too exposed to the main trail, too visible from the lower slopes. If trouble came, they'd need somewhere more secure. He spent the rest of the afternoon scouting the higher ridge, where the pines grew thick and the terrain turned treacherous. There was a sheltered hollow up there, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Years ago, he'd found signs that Ute hunters had used it as a camp. With some work, it could serve as a refuge. When he returned to the cabin, Riley was singing softly to Grace, an old hymn about God's protection. The scene struck him with unexpected force. This small family he'd somehow acquired, these lives now dependent on his care. The threat felt more real, more personal than ever. "Something wrong?" Riley asked, noting his expression. Luke considered how much to tell her. She was still recovering, still needed rest. But she also deserved to know the danger. "Had a visitor," he said finally, hanging his snow-covered coat by the door. "Trader from town. Says the railroad men are asking after you, offering rewards." Riley's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "Moran?" "Aye. Him and his men, spreading word far as Fort Collins." Luke moved to add wood to the fire, letting the familiar task calm his thoughts. "Might need to move you up to the high ridge if trouble comes. There's a place there, well hidden." "I won't put you in more danger," Riley protested. "You've done so much already." Luke turned to face her, his expression grave. "Made a promise to protect you and the little one. Aim to keep it." Riley's eyes filled with tears. "Why, Luke? Why risk so much for us?" He thought of the letter from Reverend Harlan, still tucked in his Bible. Thought of Sarah's faith, of Grace's tiny fingers gripping his, of Riley's quiet strength. "Because it's right," he said simply, "and maybe because the good Lord knew I needed reminding of what's worth fighting for." Grace stirred in her cradle, making small, fussy sounds. Luke watched as Riley lifted her, soothing her with gentle words. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows. He moved to check the locks on the door and shutters, his mind already planning what they'd need if they had to flee to the ridge. The peaceful days of Christmas and New Year's seemed suddenly fragile, like the thin ice on the creek. But as Luke watched Riley rock Grace back to sleep, he felt a fierce resolve growing in his heart. He'd lost everything once before: his wife, his faith, his place among people. He wouldn't lose this new family that God had somehow sent to his door. The trader's warning hung in the air like wood smoke, a reminder that danger was never far away on the frontier. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had this warm cabin, this quiet evening, this moment of grace. Luke sat down to clean his rifle, listening to Riley's soft singing and the pop of burning pine in the hearth. Tomorrow he'd start preparing the ridge shelter, just in case. Tomorrow he'd worry about railroad men and their threats. But tonight, he let himself rest in the peace they'd found, knowing that whatever came, they'd face it together. The evening deepened into night. Grace slept soundly in her cross-marked cradle, while Riley dozed in her chair by the fire. Luke stood at the window, watching snow fall in the darkness, standing guard over the precious gift of family he'd never expected to find again. The middle of January brought an unexpected warmth to the mountains. Snow began melting in patches, dripping from pine boughs and forming icy rivulets down the slopes. After weeks of being confined indoors, Riley stood at the cabin door, breathing deeply of the crisp morning air, while Grace slept peacefully in her arms. Luke watched from where he chopped wood, noting how the pallor had left her cheeks. The fresh air seemed to revive her spirit, bringing a gentle smile to her face as she gazed across the valley. She'd recovered well from the birth, though he still caught her wincing sometimes when she moved too quickly. "Feels like spring," Riley said, adjusting the blanket around Grace. "Even if it won't last." Luke nodded, splitting another log with practiced ease. "Just a brief thaw. Winter ain't done with us yet." He was stacking the fresh-cut wood when Riley's voice sharpened with concern. "Luke, there's smoke in the valley." He straightened, following her gaze. A dark column rose against the pale sky, too thick and dark for a simple campfire. His jaw tightened as he counted, at least 3 distinct sources of smoke. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Lock the door. I need to scout." Riley clutched Grace closer, her earlier contentment vanishing. "You think it's them? The railroad men?" "Won't know till I look." He grabbed his rifle and checked the ammunition. "Stay alert. If you hear anything—" "I remember where to hide," she finished. They'd discussed this possibility many times over the past weeks. Luke touched Grace's tiny hand once, then headed down the slope, moving from cover to cover. The rocky terrain and patches of melting snow made tracking difficult, but he'd learned these mountains well over the years. He knew every approach, every hidden vantage point. From a sheltered outcrop, he studied the valley through his scope. His heart sank as he counted the riders, 6 men, heavily armed, following the old game trail that led toward his cabin. He recognized the leader's bay stallion, the same horse the railroad foreman Moran had ridden during his previous visit. Luke didn't wait to see more. He backtracked quickly, taking a different route to avoid leaving a clear trail. When he reached the cabin, Riley had already packed their essential supplies: food, blankets, medicine, and Grace's warmest clothes. "How many?" she asked, reading his expression. 6 riders. Moran's leading them. Luke grabbed the cache of ammunition he'd prepared. "We need to move now. The cave's ready." They'd discovered the cave 2 weeks ago while scouting escape routes. Luke had gradually stocked it with supplies: dried meat, water, extra blankets, even a small store of firewood. It wasn't comfortable, but it was defensible and well hidden. Riley nodded, her movements quick but careful as she wrapped Grace more securely. The baby stirred but didn't cry, as if sensing the tension in the air. Luke led them up the ridge, choosing a path that would be difficult to follow even without snow covering their tracks. The cave entrance was narrow, barely visible behind a screen of pine branches, but it opened into a deeper chamber that stayed surprisingly warm. Luke had laid down fresh pine boughs for bedding and positioned supplies within easy reach. "Stay quiet and keep back from the entrance," he instructed, helping Riley settle with the baby. "There's enough food for 3 days, though it shouldn't take that long." Riley caught his arm as he turned to leave. "What are you going to do?" "Lead them away from here. Make them think you've already gone." "Luke, please." Her grip tightened. "Don't fight them. Not alone. We could all leave together, find somewhere safer." He covered her hand with his own, rough fingers gentle against her skin. "Some things a man's got to stand for," he said softly, "or kneel for." The words carried the weight of conviction, of faith slowly rekindled. "Then I'll pray," Riley whispered, tears bright in her eyes. "For all of us." Luke nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He touched Grace's cheek once more, then slipped out of the cave. The afternoon light was fading, shadows lengthening across the snow. He made his way back to the cabin, deliberately leaving visible tracks this time. Inside, he worked quickly to make it appear Riley had already fled. He scattered some supplies, left a half-packed bag by the door, made sure the cradle was empty but hadn't been there long. Then he positioned himself where he could watch both approaches to the cabin. The riders appeared just as dusk was settling, their horses breathing hard from the climb. Luke counted them through his scope: Moran, 4 men he recognized from their previous visit, and 1 new face, all armed, all looking grim. They spread out around the cabin, professional in their movements. Luke recognized the tactics from his scouting days. Moran dismounted first, studying the ground before approaching the door. "Redden," he called out. "We know you're in there. Time to talk business." Luke waited, letting the tension build. He could see the men growing uneasy in the gathering dark. "Ain't no business between us," he finally answered, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Moran smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's where you're wrong. You're harboring a thief, a woman who stole valuable property from the railroad. We just want what's ours." "Ain't no woman here," Luke said. "Left 2 days ago, heading north." "Now see, I don't believe that." Moran gestured, and his men began spreading wider, seeking better positions. "Why don't you come out, and we can discuss this civilized-like?" Luke's finger rested lightly on his rifle's trigger. He could take out 2, maybe 3 before they reached cover. But that wasn't God's way, wasn't Sarah's way, nor Riley's. "Nothing to discuss. I've told you what I know." "Have it your way, then." Moran's voice hardened. "Boys, search the cabin, thoroughly." 2 men approached the door, while others covered them. Luke watched through his scope, waiting. The first man kicked the door open, rifle ready. "Empty," came the call moments later. "Place is cold, no fire for hours, but someone left in a hurry. Stuff scattered everywhere. Luke could see Moran's scowl, even in the failing light. Search the outbuildings. Then we'll have another talk with our friend up there. The men moved methodically, checking the small barn and storage shed. Luke remained still, watching. He'd positioned himself on a rise above the cabin, where he had clear lines of sight but multiple retreat routes. Nothing, reported one of the searchers. But there's tracks leading north, like he said. Recent ones. Could be a woman. Moran studied the darkening sky, then the surrounding ridges. Too late to follow tonight. We'll camp here, pick up the trail at first light. He raised his voice. Hear that, Redden? We ain't leaving until we find her. Luke said nothing. Let them waste time following the false trail he'd laid. Every hour they spent here was another hour Riley and Grace had to rest, to stay safe in their hidden shelter. He watched as the men made camp, building fires near the cabin. They posted guards. Professional work, he had to admit. But they were looking outward, expecting trouble from the surrounding forest. They weren't watching the high ridge where Riley and Grace lay hidden. As full dark settled over the mountain, Luke eased back from his position. He needed to check on his charges, make sure they were warm enough for the night ahead. Moving silently through territory he knew by heart, he circled wide around the cabin and made his way back to the cave. Riley was awake, cradling a sleeping Grace. She looked up anxiously as he slipped inside. I heard voices, she whispered. Shouting. They're camping at the cabin, Luke explained quietly, checking that the blankets were tucked securely around them. Following false trails tomorrow. What if they find us? They won't. He spoke with quiet certainty. Rest now. I'll keep watch. Riley caught his hand before he could leave. Thank you, she said softly. For everything. Luke squeezed her fingers gently, then eased back towards the cave entrance. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars sharp as icicles overhead. From his position he could see the glow of the raiders' fires below, could hear the occasional murmur of voices carried on the wind. He settled into his watching stance, rifle ready across his knees. In the cave behind him, Riley began humming softly, a hymn he recognized from Sarah's Bible meetings, long ago. The familiar melody wrapped around him like a warm blanket, strengthening his resolve. Let them come searching tomorrow. He would be ready. Some things were worth standing for: faith, family, justice. And sometimes, he reflected, the Lord's plan required a man to do both, to stand and fight when needed, and to kneel in prayer when that was the stronger choice. The night deepened. Luke kept his vigil, watching over his unexpected charges, ready to defend this new family that God had entrusted to his care. Below, the raiders' fires burned low, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called out to the stars. The winter night held its breath. Luke's muscles ached from hours of keeping watch, but he dared not shift position. Below, the raiders' fires had burned to embers. 2 men still patrolled, their boots crunching in the crusty snow. A twig snapped. The sound came from behind him, up the slope where he knew Riley and Grace were hidden. His heart seized. Had she ventured out? But no. A mountain lion's screech split the darkness, followed by the crash of something large moving through the brush. The patrol stopped. Rifles raised. The first shot shattered the night's silence. Luke's world exploded into chaos. Return fire erupted from multiple positions. They'd been flanking him while he focused on the cabin. Amateur's mistake. He squeezed off 2 quick shots, hearing a cry of pain as one found its mark. But there were too many angles to cover. Bullets splintered the rocks around him. He rolled left, then right, trying to throw off their aim. A hot line of fire scored across his ribs. Not deep, but enough to make him gasp. He couldn't stay here. They had him pinned. "Flush him out," Moran's voice carried clearly. "Smoke the rat from his hole." Orange light bloomed below. They'd set torches to his cabin. Luke's throat tightened as he watched flames lick up the log walls. 20 years of solitude, of memories both bitter and sweet, began to burn. He had to draw them away from the ridge, away from Riley and Grace. Taking a deep breath, Luke broke cover and ran, not toward the cave but east toward the creek. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet. "There! Don't let him get away!" Luke managed another shot over his shoulder, but his foot caught a hidden root. He went down hard, rifle spinning away. Before he could recover, rough hands seized him. "Got him!" They dragged him back toward the burning cabin, boots leaving deep furrows in the snow. The heat of the fire struck his face as 2 men forced him to his knees. His home had become a tower of flames, sparks spiraling up into the black sky. Moran's boots appeared in Luke's downturned vision. A hand grabbed his hair, yanking his head back. The foreman's face was a mask of controlled rage. "That girl dies," he snarled, "and so do you." His fist crashed into Luke's jaw. "Where is she?" Luke spat blood onto the snow. "Told you. Ran east weeks ago." Another blow rocked his head back. "Lying mountain trash. We found fresh tracks, women's boots, not 3 days old." "Traitors," Luke mumbled through swollen lips. "Come through here sometimes. Heading to Fort Collins." Moran drove a knee into his stomach. Luke doubled over, retching. The raiders held him up as their boss continued the beating, methodical in his cruelty. Each blow was punctuated by questions about Riley, about papers, about water rights. Luke kept to his story. She'd gone east. He hadn't seen her since. Finally, Moran stepped back, breathing hard. "Leave him. Let him freeze beside his precious cabin." He wiped blood from his knuckles. "We'll pick up the trail at first light. That woman's somewhere close. I can smell it." They released Luke. He crumpled into the blood-stained snow, every breath sending shards of pain through his ribs. Boots crunched away. Through swollen eyes, he watched them return to their camp, leaving him beside the inferno that had been his home. The heat was unbearable. Luke began to crawl, inch by inch, away from the flames. He had to reach the creek, had to get water on these burns, had to stay alive for Riley's sake, for Grace. "Sarah," he whispered, his wife's name a prayer on bloody lips. "Help me stay strong." The distance to the creek seemed endless. Every movement was agony. But Luke kept going, dragging himself through the snow. Behind him, the cabin's roof collapsed with a thunderous crash. 20 years of isolation, burning to ash. Yet somehow he felt lighter, like chains of bitterness were melting away in the flames. "Lord," he prayed, words barely audible, "keep them safe. Keep Riley and that baby girl safe." The creek's bank loomed ahead, a dark slash in the white landscape. Luke reached the edge and slumped, exhausted. Above, heavy clouds were gathering. The first few snowflakes began to drift down, gentle as mercy. He watched through fading vision as the snow fell faster, covering the blood trail he'd left. Nature herself conspiring to hide his path from the raiders. A smile cracked his split lips. The Lord did work in mysterious ways. The snow continued falling, blanketing the ruins of his cabin, covering the ashes of his old life. Luke lay beside the frozen creek, hurting but alive. And in that moment of extremity, he felt closer to God than he had in 20 years of hiding from his faith. Consciousness began to slip away. The last thing Luke saw was the snow, pure and white, erasing all signs of violence from the mountain. His last thought was of Riley and Grace, safe in their cave, protected by more than just his strength now. Protected by Providence itself. The night deepened. Snow continued to fall, and Luke Redden, no longer a hermit but a guardian, surrendered to the darkness, his prayers rising like smoke into the winter sky. The cold gnawed at Luke's bones. Through the haze of pain, he felt rough hands turning him over, heard a familiar voice murmuring in both Ute and English. Dawn's pale light filtered through his swollen eyelids. "Brother Luke," the voice said softly, "the Creator has not finished with you yet." Luke forced his eyes open. Henry Tall Elk's weathered face swam into focus, concern etched in the lines around his dark eyes. The Ute scout wrapped Luke in thick buffalo robes, his movements careful and practiced. "Henry," Luke croaked. His throat felt like sandpaper. "The woman. They're hunting." "Peace," Henry said, checking Luke's wounds. "First we get you warm, then we talk." He pressed a water skin to Luke's cracked lips. Small sips. The water tasted of willow bark, medicine for pain and fever. Henry had always known the old ways of healing. Luke remembered how the scout had once saved him during the Indian Wars, treating an arrow wound with similar care. Henry's horse stood nearby, steam rising from its flanks in the bitter morning air. With gentle strength, the Ute helped Luke onto the animal. Pain shot through Luke's beaten body, but he gritted his teeth and held on as Henry led them away from the smoking ruins of the cabin. They rode through morning mist, following a hidden trail Luke had never noticed before. The path wound down into a sheltered canyon, where a small winter lodge stood among the pines. Smoke rose from its center hole, promising warmth within. Inside, Henry's wife Sarah Bird had already prepared a bed of soft furs. They eased Luke down, and she began applying poultices to his wounds. The familiar scent of healing herbs filled the lodge, yarrow, sage, and something Luke couldn't name. For 2 days, Luke drifted between sleep and waking. Henry kept watch, speaking little but always present. When fever gripped Luke on the second night, the Ute sang softly, ancient healing songs that seemed to chase the darkness away. On the third morning, Luke woke clear-headed. He sat up carefully, testing his strength. Henry offered him a cup of strong tea. "The railroad men," Luke said after drinking. "They're stealing land with false deeds." Henry nodded gravely. "We know. 3 moons ago they drove my cousin's family from their winter grounds, showed papers with forged marks, claimed the water rights." His eyes grew distant. "Now they graze cattle where our children once played." Luke's hands tightened on the clay cup. "The woman they're hunting, Riley, she has proof of their crimes. Papers that could expose it all." "Ah." Henry studied him. "So that is why you fight now. For justice? For her baby." Luke paused. "For everyone they've wronged." Henry was silent for a long moment, stoking the lodge's central fire. Finally he spoke. "Mercy is heavier than lead, brother." "What do you mean?" "A bullet weighs little, ends much. But mercy?" Henry gestured to Luke's healing wounds. "Mercy carries the weight of all it saves. You chose mercy when you took in the woman. Now you carry her fate, her child's fate, the fate of many." Luke absorbed this. The warmth of the fire seemed to reach deeper, touching something long frozen in his soul. "I have to find her," he said. "Make sure she's safe." "Yes." Henry rose and went to a painted chest in the corner. "But first you need strength." He returned with a worn cavalry saddle. "My best horse is yours." Luke started to protest, but Henry raised a hand. "The debt is mine to pay. You spared my life once, in the war. Now I return the blessing." Together they prepared for Luke's departure. Henry's wife packed food and medicines, while Henry himself helped Luke mount the strong bay horse. Just before Luke could ride out, Henry pressed something into his hand, an eagle feather, ancient and sacred, wrapped in soft leather. "A blessing from my grandfather," Henry explained. "He said it carries the wisdom of the wind. Go with clean hands, brother. The Creator watches your path." Luke's throat tightened. He carefully tucked the feather into his shirt, close to his heart. "Thank you, my friend." "Go," Henry said simply. "Find your destiny." Luke touched his heels to the horse's flanks. As he rode up out of the canyon, he glanced back once. Henry stood straight and tall before his lodge, one hand raised in farewell. The morning sun caught the smoke rising from the lodge, turning it to gold. Luke turned north, toward the high country where he'd hidden Riley and Grace. His body still ached, but his spirit felt stronger than it had in years. Henry's words echoed in his mind. Mercy is heavier than lead. He would carry that weight now, carry it gladly. The horses' hooves kicked up snow as they climbed. Behind them, the sun rose fully over the mountains, painting the world in shades of promise. Luke's horse picked its way carefully through the snow-laden pines. 2 nights of hard riding had brought him back to the cave, where he'd hidden Riley and Grace. His heart pounded as he dismounted, scanning for tracks or signs of trouble. "Riley?" he called softly into the cave's mouth. His voice echoed off stone walls. A moment passed, then came a whispered response. "Luke." Riley emerged from the shadows, Grace bundled tight against her chest. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes lit up with wonder. We saw the smoke. I feared they'd killed you." Luke stepped forward, his throat tight. Riley's free hand reached out, touching his bruised face with trembling fingers. "Thank the Lord," she whispered. "We've been praying every night." Inside the cave, Luke saw how carefully she'd maintained their supplies. Food was stacked in neat portions, water collected from melted snow. But the rations were running low, and Riley's cheeks had grown hollow with hunger. She'd been feeding Grace first, keeping the baby strong while she grew weaker. "The cabin's gone," Luke said quietly, settling beside them. "They burned it all. But that evidence in your Bible, it might be our salvation now. My friend Henry says the Ute people have suffered from these same false deeds. Together we could stop them." Grace stirred, making tiny sounds of hunger. Luke reached into his saddlebag for the goat's milk and sugar Henry's wife had packed. As Riley fed the baby, fat snowflakes began drifting past the cave mouth. "Another storm," Riley sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if God's forgotten us up here." Luke watched the snow falling, remembering Henry's words about mercy. "Maybe," he said slowly. "He was just waiting for us to stop running." Riley's hand found his in the dimness. "What do we do now?" "We wait out this storm. Then we ride for Cannon City, together. It's time to face them with the truth." The storm's fury finally exhausted itself 3 days after their reunion in the cave. Morning sunlight sparkled on fresh snow as Luke gathered fallen pine boughs and rope to fashion a crude sled. "It ain't pretty," he said, testing the makeshift runners, "but it'll keep you and Grace warm enough." Riley nodded, cradling the baby close as Luke helped them settle into the nest of blankets he'd arranged. The journey to Cannon City stretched before them like a white ribbon through the wilderness. Luke rode ahead on horseback, leading them through narrow canyons where icy walls rose steep on either side. The horses' hooves crunched through crusted snow while the sled whispered behind them. Each night, they found shelter in the hollow shells of abandoned mining shacks. Luke would string up the canvas tarp to block the wind, then gather wood for a small fire. While Riley nursed Grace under warm blankets, he kept watch with his rifle across his knees, scanning the darkness for movement. "Strange to think," Riley whispered on the second night, "how that letter from Reverend Harlan led us here." She touched Grace's downy head as the baby suckled. "As if he knew we'd need each other." Luke pulled the worn envelope from his coat, studying the familiar handwriting. The paper felt warm against his calloused fingers, a reminder that even in his years of running, faith had followed him into the wilderness. On the third evening, they crested a ridge and saw Cannon City's lights twinkling in the valley below. The sight made Riley catch her breath. Luke reached into his coat, touching the preacher's letter like a talisman. "The Lord sure picks interesting paths," he said quietly, remembering how he'd once sworn never to return to town. Now here he was, leading a mother and child toward whatever justice awaited them. The letter in his pocket seemed to pulse with purpose, proof that faith, like mercy, found its own way through the mountains. Dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks and golds as Luke guided the sled through Cannon City's empty streets. Their journey ended at a modest white church, its steeple reaching skyward like a finger pointing to heaven. The parsonage sat beside it, warm lamplight already glowing in its windows. Reverend Harlan opened the door before they could knock, his weathered face showing both shock and joy. "Luke Redden," he breathed, "after all these years." His eyes moved to Riley and the bundle in her arms. Come in quickly." Inside the warm parlor, Riley unwrapped her precious Bible with trembling fingers. "The proof is here, Reverend," she said, pulling out folded papers tucked between its pages. "Every forged deed, every stolen acre." By afternoon, the town council chamber was packed. Sheriff Kell stood grim-faced near the wall as Reverend Harlan read the documents aloud, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. The papers detailed how railroad foreman Moran and his men had systematically stolen land from both settlers and Ute tribes through falsified water rights. Angry shouts filled the room. "Thieves!" someone called. "Hanging's too good for them." Sheriff Kell raised his hands for quiet. "Justice will be done proper," he declared. "Moran's already in custody. We'll hold restitution hearings for every piece of stolen land." Luke stood then, his voice rough but clear. "My homestead up Shadow Creek way," he announced. "I'm declaring it free and clear for Riley Quinn and her child." He turned to Riley, who clutched Grace closer as tears spilled down her cheeks. The chamber erupted in cheers. Outside, the church bells began to ring, their joyful pealing spreading news of justice across the valley. Reverend Harlan placed a hand on Luke's shoulder, smiling as the sound of truth and righteousness filled the air. The April sun warmed the mountain slopes, turning weeks of stubborn snow into rushing streams. Around Luke's rebuilt cabin, patches of fresh grass pushed through melting drifts. The new walls stood strong and true, hewn from pine logs and sealed with fresh mud chinking. A small vegetable garden, freshly tilled, waited for Riley's careful planting. Luke knelt beside Sarah's grave, his calloused hands working the softening earth. The lilac bushes he'd brought from town were small but sturdy, their bare branches promising purple blooms by summer. He'd chosen the spot carefully, where morning light would touch the flowers first. These were her favorites, he explained quietly to Riley, who stood nearby with 9-month-old Grace balanced on her hip. The baby reached toward a budding branch with chubby fingers, making soft cooing sounds that echoed in the mountain quiet. "She would have loved seeing them here," Riley said softly, understanding in her voice. She set Grace down on a sun-warmed patch of grass, where the child immediately began exploring with determined crawling. The sound of horses made them look up. Henry Tall Elk approached on his paint pony, leading several members of his band. They carried bundles of sage and eagle feathers for the blessing ceremony. Henry dismounted with fluid grace, his dark eyes taking in the new cabin, the garden plots, the family gathered there. "The land welcomes new life," he said, clasping Luke's arm in greeting. "We bring good words to bless this ground." The blessing ceremony was simple but profound. Henry and the tribal elders walked the perimeter of the cabin, wafting sacred smoke and speaking prayers in their ancient tongue. They blessed the garden soil, the new roof beams, the fresh dug well. Grace watched with wide eyes from Riley's arms, reaching for the drifting sage smoke. When the ceremony ended, they shared a meal of venison stew and cornbread around the outdoor fire pit. The spring wind carried wood smoke and promise through the valley. Children from Henry's band played with Grace, their laughter bright as mountain streams. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the peaks in gold and rose, the Ute visitors mounted their horses for the ride home. Henry paused before leaving, looking at Luke with knowing eyes. "The bitter winter is past," he said. "Now you tend new growth." After their guests departed, Riley and Luke sat on the cabin's front step, watching Grace toddle between them on uncertain feet. The evening air carried the fresh scent of pine and warming earth. Riley's garden tools leaned against the wall, ready for tomorrow's planting. "Thank you," Riley said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. "For giving us a home, for everything." Luke looked at her. This woman who had arrived in desperate need and stayed to help him rebuild more than just a cabin. His smile came slow but genuine. "You gave me one too," he said simply. The evening settled around them like a gentle blessing. Inside, the table was set. For supper. 3 plates now, where once there had been one. The Bible lay open near the window, its pages marked with pressed wildflowers. Grace's cradle sat in the corner, draped with a quilt Riley had sewn through the winter. Luke scooped up Grace as she wobbled past, lifting her high as she squealed with delight. Looking into her innocent face, he remembered that snowy night months ago, when her mother's desperate words had pierced his frozen heart. "Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt?" he whispered, then smiled tenderly at the happy child. "Not anymore, little one. Not anymore." They gathered inside for the evening meal, lamplight gleaming warm on the new wooden walls. Through the open door drifted the promise of lilac buds, waiting to bloom. Their prayers of thanks rose simple and true to the darkening sky, while the great mountains stood peaceful around them, witnesses to mercy's quiet triumph. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.